Hey YouTube, today we're going to be doing the review of the 9700X. This is a retail sample. We're going to be comparing that CPU, AMD's new Zen 5 CPU, to the 7800X because that's probably the one that everyone seems to want to compare it to. But we're also going to be taking a look at how it stacks up to the previous generation 7700X, as well as a couple of Intel CPUs. Then we're going to look at some older AMD CPUs and see how this CPU stacks up against older CPUs to give you guys an idea if you're still on AM4, if you're on an older Intel system, or if you're on any sort of DDR4 based system, is it worth upgrading to the newest, latest, and greatest Zen 5 architecture from AMD and making the jump to DDR5. First, a word from our sponsor. We often talk a lot about video game performance when comparing PC hardware on this channel, but are you thinking about what it would be like to program games to better take advantage of the hardware? That brings me to the sponsor of this video, Southern New Hampshire University, or SNHU. Southern New Hampshire University's online game development program gives you the knowledge and experience to create your own video games and help turn it into an actual career with opportunities for growth. You'll learn how to bring characters and environments to life with 2D and 3D modeling, texturing, and game physics, how to create dynamic and challenging experiences developing game AI. The university program covers major programming languages like C++, C#, and Java, all fundamental to game programming. The courses are taught by faculty with real-world experience, so you'll have opportunities to connect and network with people in industry. The university also helps after graduation with the job hunt process. SNHU is accredited and has radically affordable tuition. SNHU is voted one of the country's most innovative universities by US News and World Report. Go to snhu.edu/GTR, also linked in the description of this video, to see if you qualify for SNHU's game development program or to simply learn more. You might be eligible for financial aid or have previous college credits transfer over to fast-track your degree at SNHU. Click the link to get started. Okay, so for the AM5 test system, we tested with an X670GB Aorus Elite AX. All tests were done based off of the maximum official supported speed for 2 sticks of memory. We do this because we always follow the stock official spec. Because if somebody is buying a pre-built, most likely they're going to be running at the maximum supported speed if they're even running at Expo or XMP. For the AM4, the Ryzen 7 3800X and the 5800X, so basically Zen 2 and Zen 3, these are all using air cooling, so every single CPU tested was using the Noctua NHD15. All tests were done using the Radeon RX 7900 XTX. Gaming benchmarks were only done at 1080p because as you go up in resolution, it reduces the impact the CPU has. So yes, I am aware that 1440p will still show the differences between the CPUs. However, all it does is it shrinks the gap between them, and then once you go to 4K, everything just kind of clutters together. For the Z590 test system, so this one was used to test Intel's Rocket Lake CPU, so the i7 11700K. This was a DDR4 exclusive based system, so it was tested with the same RAM that the Ryzen CPUs that are on DDR4 used. And then for the Z690 platform, so what I did here is I'm trying to showcase a realistic comparison in the sense that most people that bought Intel's 12th gen processor when it was new back in 2021 or early 2022, they were most likely pairing it up with a DDR4 motherboard. So I think this is the more relevant comparison if you're looking at how an Alder Lake CPU compares to the new Zen 5. So we're doing DDR4, exclusively DDR4 on the 12700K with the same air cooler, same GPU, same everything else. However, for the 14700K, what I have done here is I've simulated the 14700K results using a 13900K where I went into the BIOS and I disabled some of the E-cores so it only has 12 E-cores instead of 16, so I turned 4 of them off. And then on top of that, I also capped the maximum boost for the single core to 5.5 because that is how the 14700K behaves. So I basically turned a 13900K into a 14700K. Yes, I know there are differences with cache. I can't eliminate the extra cache that the i9 has, but this is the closest I can do to simulate the 14700K behavior or results. Again, with a Noctua NHD15, because I shouldn't be forced to use liquid cooling. I don't care. I should not be forced to use liquid cooling. On top of that, this is a DDR5 based test system because most people that bought into the 14th gen last year or the 13th gen the previous year had the opportunity to pair it up with DDR5 because at that point in time, DDR5 was more affordable. So I think most people that have a Z790 motherboard tend to have a DDR5 system unless they really just wanted to cheap out on reusing their old DDR4. However, we are going to see that in some of the tests, DDR5 makes a pretty big, significant difference versus DDR4. So if you're on 14th gen and you pair it up with DDR4, in some use cases, you are bottlenecking the CPU. Okay, so for the first game, Final Fantasy XIV Dawntrail at 1080p maximum. This is the latest benchmark for Final Fantasy XIV. And as you guys can see, the 9700X, it's about 9% slower than the X3D, 4% slower than the 14700K, but 3% faster than the previous generation 7700X, 10% faster than the 5800X, and 37% faster than the 3800X. So one thing I do want to point out going forward with a lot of these benchmarks, I think a lot of other reviewers only focused on how Zen 5 compares to Zen 4 and how Zen 5 compares to Raptor Lake. And that's totally fine. That is a valid comparison. However, I think most people that are interested in doing an actual CPU upgrade or even a platform upgrade where they have to buy new RAM, they have to buy a new motherboard, they're most likely going to be coming from a much older system, either a 3-year-old, a 5-year-old, or even a 7-year-old or older system. And I think that is far more in line with what most people would be interested in comparing to. So next we have Shadow of the Tomb Raider at 1080p max. It's about 12% slower than the X3D, 3% slower than the 14700K, 6% faster than the 7700X, 23% faster than the 5800X, and a whopping 67% faster than the 3800X. So keep in mind, if you are coming from an older system, you're going to see a significant uplift if you're coming from an older system. And the other thing, too, is out of the box, the 9700X behaves more like a non-X part from Zen 4, if that makes sense. So it's kind of more like a 7700. If you turn PBO on, then it behaves a lot more like a 7700X in terms of the way it more aggressively boosts. It uses more power. So if you do that, then it returns the behavior back to the way all the Zen 4 CPUs pretty much behaved, at least if they had an X in the name. So when we turn PBO on, with just one button in the BIOS, we just turn it on, the gap narrows between the X3D. So now it goes from like 12% slower to 9% slower. So it claws back like 3% when comparing to the X3D. It manages to tie the 14700K when you set it to behave more like a 7700X, and it's 9% faster now than the 7700X. So for Horizon Zero Dawn, see, the X3D is still faster as expected, even with PBO on, although with PBO it does get quite close. So it's about 5% slower than the X3D. It's 15% faster than the 14700K. I will say that this game, the AMD CPUs tend to do very well in Horizon Zero Dawn specifically. As you guys can see here, the 5800X is tying, or it's actually slightly outperforming, at least on the average, the 12700K. But the 9700X is 25% faster than the 5800X. Now, it does tie at stock with the 7700X, but it's kind of weird because it's like a 65 watt versus a 105 watt, and they're tying, so it's strange. Sometimes it makes it look like it has really good efficiency, and then other times I can see why people think it's a bit underwhelming. But then compared to the older CPUs, 50% faster than the 3800X, that is pretty significant. 50% faster in 5 years. I mean, although it is 5 years, so it's like, but it's still a significant uplift if you're someone who's on a much older CPU. As for Hogwarts Legacy, so I always test the CPU benchmark for Hogwarts Legacy in Hogsmeade. That is the most CPU bound area in the game. In this test, compared to the previous generation, it's 6% faster. than the 7700X. The 9700X is still quite a bit faster than the older AMD CPUs, the DDR4 AMD CPUs. So it's 46% faster than the 5800X and 75% faster than the 3800X. So that is pretty significant. And for those of you that are wondering kind of like what is the Intel equivalent? So if you're looking at the 3800X, this is more like an i9 9900K. That's kind of where the 3800X lines up. And then the 5800X is very similar to the 11th gen and the 10th gen. So if you have a 10th gen Intel, like a 10700 or a 10900, you want to pay attention to either the 11th gen Intel or sometimes the AMD 5800X is also very similar. But 10th gen is close enough. And then for Starfield, this is the one game that I tested where the 9700X actually beat the X3D. So I did multiple test runs to confirm this again and again and again, and it beat it every single time. So 118 versus 114. So it was 4% faster than the 7800X3D. However, Intel's 14700K did even better. So even though it was 4% faster than the X3D, it was 3% slower than the 14700K in this game. At stock, the 9700X is still 3% faster than the Zen 4, 7700X 21% faster than the 5800X, and 53% faster than the 3800X. So it's still putting out some pretty decent uplifts over the previous generations. And then finally, probably the most CPU-bound game to release this year would be Dragon's Dogma 2. So Dragon's Dogma 2 at 1080p Ultra in Vernworth. If you want to test for a CPU bottleneck, you got to go to Vernworth because that's where it's going to bring every CPU down into the ground, literally. So if we look at the results here, the best CPUs in this is actually X3D and Intel's 14th gen. However, the 9700X is still the best of AMD's non-X3D enabled CPUs. So you can see it is 7% faster than the 7700X, 28% faster than the 5800X, and 58% faster than the 11th gen Intel and the Zen 2 based 3800X. So for these next benchmarks, I have synthetics and we have some productivity stuff. So I'm not going to spend too much time on a lot of these. You can pause the video if you want to see some of these results. Kind of in the way of the 9700X, but you can see 9700X is like right above me, and then here are the results for the PBO. And then for Cinebench, you can see the single thread performance is a pretty good uplift, I would say, over the Zen 4 CPUs, and then that does translate into better multi-thread performance. 7-zip, you can see the numbers. It does better than Zen 4 and the previous generations, but this one is definitely a more multi-thread workload, so the 14700K is still going to have better results because it has all those extra E-cores with 12 extra E-cores. And then we did some CPU benchmarks to kind of show more synthetic. So this is the standard CPU Z benchmark. Then we have the AVX2 benchmark. So for CPU Z AVX512, this one is probably the most interesting one. One thing that it shows is that there's an 18% improvement versus Zen 4 in this type of workload. And that is good to see considering AMD put a lot of effort into re-architecting the AVX512 pipeline, where previously it was like a dual 256. Now it's a single full data path 512. So that is really nice to see that uplift. And then comparing it to Intel's 11th gen. So the 11th gen was the last Intel consumer CPU to officially support AVX512 instructions. And you can see the new Zen 5 is 35% faster than Intel. And then I did do Geekbench. Again, Geekbench, the single thread results are very good to see. We do see some pretty good uplifts here in the synthetics. So we see a 13% uplift versus the 7700X and a 12% uplift in multi-thread over last generation for a single CCD part. And then finally, we did some Blender benchmarks. And the one thing I want to point out about the Blender results is all the CPUs that have DDR5 memory are less than 14 seconds to do this render test. whereas all the DDR4 based systems, that includes the 12700K, because that was tested on DDR4, those are significantly longer in terms of the time it takes for them to complete. I would say that the reason why the 12700 does a lot better than the other DDR4 CPUs is because it has 4 E-cores, whereas those others don't have any E-cores. And then these are the average gaming results. You guys can see this is all of them averaged out from all the tests that I did. And then if we look, we break it down where it only shows the Zen CPUs without X3D and without all the Intel CPUs. You can see the uplift averaged out. So in gaming at 1080p, the 9700X is 2% faster in gaming than the previous 7700X, 20% faster than the 5800X, and 51% faster than the 3800X, a CPU from 2019. I included the model year releases for all of these so you guys can get an idea of how old these CPUs are versus the new Zen 5. And then if we add PBO to make the boost behavior more like the 7700X stock behavior, now it's 56% faster than the 3800X, 24% faster than the 5800X, and 5% faster than the 7700X. So the uplift isn't that great considering the 7700X got an 18% uplift over the 5800X. And I think a lot of that it comes down to Zen 4 got a big frequency uplift and it got DDR5, whereas this time around Zen 5 basically the same IO die, so fabric didn't really change much. So much more moderate in terms of changes, although there were some significant architectural changes made under the hood for things like AVX512. So there's stuff like that where I think it's going to come down to software support. And then the average power consumption while gaming is interesting to see. So this is really Intel's Achilles heel. If we do a direct comparison between the 9700X and the 14700K, the 9700X uses 44% less energy in gaming compared to the 14700K. And that is significant. Why is that significant? Because the amount of heat in your room while gaming, especially in competitive gaming where the FPS is very high, so the frame rate is typically uncapped, or it's like capped to like 240 hertz if you're on like an OLED screen or something. It's not going to be a very comfortable experience if you're gaming for like 3 hours or more, if you know what I'm saying. So that is significant. That 44% less power while gaming compared to the 4700K is significant. And then compared to the previous generation, it's interesting because while gaming, it uses 15% more energy than the 7700X. I find that kind of strange, yet the power limit, the stock power limit of the 9700X restricts it to around 88 watts under full load, which means the lightly threaded stuff, it seems like it uses a little bit more power than the previous generation. But when you max it out, so now if we're doing like rendering, for example, so this is the power. These are the power consumption numbers when we're running R23. Now you can see the 9700X stock doesn't exceed 88 watts. So it's almost as efficient as a 7800X 3D under full load. However, you turn PBO on, and now it jumps up to almost 150 watts. So, but with PBO, it's definitely getting a massive uplift in multi-thread performance. And it's also way ahead of the 7700X with PBO enabled. So kind of interesting to see. It definitely puts Intel CPUs to shame. Even looking at the last gen, like the older CPUs, like 12th gen, 11th gen, those didn't look that good. And you can see how they compared to Ryzen of that era. I mean, they've just kind of been behind. All right, CPU thermals while gaming. This is all using a Noctua NHD15. These are the temperatures that we see while gaming. So it's very well behaved out of the box. 61 degrees Celsius. You turn PBO on, it's going to jump up to the upper 60s. And then if we look at the full load under a Noctua air cooler, you can see at full load stock, the CPU is only running like 72 degrees. So that is excellent because that means that if you're someone who just wants to build the computer and run the CPU out of the box, and all you're going to do is like turn on Expo or XMP and then just set it and forget it, you can get away with an average air cooler or even a high-end air cooler like this, and you don't have to worry about temperatures at all. Meanwhile, if you turn PBO on, it does what I said at the beginning of the video. It behaves like a 7700X, meaning both the 7700X and the 9700X with PBO enabled try to target that 95 degrees Celsius. So you can see here these results with an NHD 15. That holds true. And then meanwhile, the 14700K basically thermal throttles and overheats with even the highest end air cooler under full load running Cinebench. So I'm the type of person who really doesn't like using liquid cooling. I prefer lower maintenance of air cooling, no worry of a leak, no worrying about a pump failure. If the fans die after like 15 years, I can just swap the fan out on an air cooler. So it's no big deal, right? Like I still have a Noctua D14 from like 12 years ago, and it still works, and both fans still work totally fine to this day. Yeah, air coolers are really what you should be able to get away with on all CPUs. That includes Intel using a 360 or 420 AIO. No, we're doing this with air, and if that's how you perform, that's the results. So conclusion time. Who is the Ryzen 7 9700X for? So I had to think pretty long and hard about this because the results were kind of middling, but I think overall, if you're somebody who has a 3 or 5 year old computer, or even older than like 7 years, and you're looking at upgrading to finally leave either AM4 or an older Intel DDR4 based system, or maybe you're even on an ancient DDR3 based system like an Intel Haswell 4970K, for example, and you're finally thinking of going to DDR5 and just completely skipping DDR4, I think then the Zen 5 Ryzen 7 9700X will be a huge upgrade. On top of that, it doesn't use that much energy, and it behaves very well. It has better productivity performance than the X3D part. It's also newer than the X3D part, being Zen 5 versus Zen 4. So there is the potential for better memory compatibility. That is something that I am going to look at in a future video. We are going to be looking at 4 sticks of DDR5. We're probably going to do some testing with the newer chipset motherboards when those show up. But we are going to be doing a lot of videos in the upcoming future about DDR5 and the 9700X and the Zen 5 architecture in general. So that is probably the main reason why I would definitely go with a 9700X versus anything older at this point. And then the CPU, you know, it's well behaved. It can be cooled by a standard air cooler like we just said. It has the full AVX512 implementation, so it performs better in that instruction set versus Zen 4 and anything else at this point in time. So for a consumer desktop, that is excellent, because if there's an uptick in developers deciding to add the AVX512 instruction set for their application, then you can stand to benefit significantly going with Zen 5 over Zen 4 or anything that lacks AVX512. The other thing too is it's got lots of PCIe 5.0 connectivity, but so does Zen 4. So that's more of a chipset thing. But then again, that goes into the whole AM5 socket longevity. So AMD has stated that this socket's good through 2027. So that is pretty significant considering this socket was new almost 2 years ago. That's a bold claim, and I think they can back it up because AM4 has already proven that. If you're someone who's coming from a very old platform, this is definitely a good one to migrate to because you still have a lot of runway if you want to upgrade in the future. And overall, those are my thoughts after having tested the 9700X and using it as a daily driver for about a week now. If you're planning to make the jump to DDR5, it's definitely worth considering. And with that said, I thank you for watching. Questions about the platform or any sort of potential ideas for a future video, do leave a comment below. That being said, I'm going to go ahead and get out of here. Thank you all for watching, and I will catch you guys next time. Thanks.